If you're trying to buy your first home in America right now, it probably feels like the door is closing in front of you. Not slowly, not gently, but right when you reach for it. You save, you build credit, you avoid the mistakes everyone warned you about. You do everything responsible adults are supposed to do. And then you step into the market and realize something that kind of breaks your brain. You're not competing with other people like you. You're competing with people who already own homes, with cash buyers, with investors, with institutions, with money that doesn't need a mortgage, doesn't need a salary, doesn't even need a place to actually live. So this isn't just a housing problem, it's a first-time buyer exclusion problem. The system still works beautifully for people who are already inside it, but it quietly and efficiently shuts the door on everyone trying to enter. And that's what we need to talk about. Not just why homes are expensive, we all know that, but why the path into ownership itself is disappearing. How we built a market that rewards ownership instead of participation. Why the bottom rung of the ladder was removed, and what that means not just for housing, but for the future of the American middle class. So let's start with Chapter 1 and understand what went wrong, and Chapter 3 is where we discuss why it broke down. For most of the 20th century, homeownership followed a pretty predictable path. You worked, you saved, you bought a modest home, you built equity, and then maybe later you upgraded. That latter worked because three things were true. First, homes were cheap relative to income. Second, supply roughly kept up with population growth. Third, and this is key, houses were treated primarily as places to live, not as financial assets. For decades, a normal home cost about 2 to 3 times the median household income. That meant a single working adult or a couple with average jobs could realistically imagine owning a home without extraordinary luck or a trust fund. That world is gone. Today, the median American home costs roughly 5 to 6 times the median household income. In cities like Los Angeles, Miami, or New York, it's 7, 8, even 10 times income. That's not a lifestyle problem, that's a math problem. And math doesn't care how responsible you are. If home prices had simply tracked with inflation since 1970, the median home today would cost around $180,000. Instead, it's over $400,000. This is why the typical first-time homebuyer is no longer 29. They're now nearly 36 years old, an all-time high. This is why people in their late 20s and early 30s increasingly feel like homeownership isn't delayed, it's unreachable. The ladder didn't just get taller, the bottom rung was removed entirely. We used to build for beginners. In the 1940s and 50s, the starter home was the engine of the middle class. These were 1,000 square foot bungalows. They weren't fancy, no granite countertops, no walk-in closets, but they were entry points. Today, those homes aren't being built. In fact, in many places, they're literally illegal to build. Through a process called exclusionary zoning, town after town across America passed laws requiring minimum lot sizes and banning anything that wasn't a large single-family detached house. They banned duplexes, they banned townhomes. The NIMBYs effectively banned affordable. Builders followed the incentives. Because the cost of land, permits, and labor has skyrocketed, a builder's profit margin on a small house is razor-thin or non-existent. If it costs a developer $250,000 in fixed costs just to get a permit and clear the land, they're not going to build a $300,000 home. They're going to build a $700,000 mansion to make the math work. This has created what's called the missing middle. We have luxury condos and sprawling estates, but the modest entry-level house has become an endangered species. And when the entry point into the system disappears, you don't just block individuals, you break the entire chain. If first-time buyers can't buy starter homes, existing owners can't move up. The market stops flowing. It becomes a club instead of a ladder. At this point, people usually say, it's inflation, or it's greedy developers. But it's deeper than that. The real shock for first-time buyers isn't just the price of the house, it's the price of access. Here's what I mean. A $400,000 home at a 3% mortgage rate costs about $1,700 a month. The same home at a 7% mortgage rate, about $2,650 a month. That's almost $1,000 more every single month for the exact same house. Nothing about the house changed, nothing about your job changed, but access disappeared. But here's another layer to the affordability story that doesn't show up when you only look at prices and mortgage rates: the running costs of owning a home. In many parts of the US, property taxes and especially home insurance have exploded, driven by higher rebuild costs and climate-related disasters. Between 2021 and 2024 alone, the typical homeowner saw annual insurance premiums jump by hundreds of dollars. And in some high-risk states, insurers are simply refusing to renew policies at all. For a first-time buyer, that means you're not just trying to afford the mortgage, you're trying to qualify for a monthly payment that now includes far higher taxes and insurance than your parents ever faced. Existing homeowners who locked in low rates years ago don't feel this shock. They're insulated. But this creates what's called the lock-in effect. Why would a homeowner sell their house with a 3% mortgage only to buy a new one at 7%? They wouldn't, so they stay put. Inventory freezes. And when inventory freezes, prices stop behaving normally. We're living through what you could call a frozen market. Demand has dropped because people are priced out, but supply has dropped even further because sellers are paralyzed. In a normal economy, low demand means lower prices. But in this economy, the lack of supply is acting as a floor, keeping prices artificially high even as the average person's ability to pay completely crumbles. The math isn't mathing. There's a second force at play here. Housing has stopped being treated as shelter and started being treated as a high-yield asset class. For decades, the safest place to put your money was a savings account or the stock market. But after the 2008 crash and the years of low interest rates that followed, big capital realized that American single-family homes were a gold mine. They were a finite resource with guaranteed demand. We love to blame Wall Street and giant hedge funds like BlackRock. And yes, they're part of the problem. But here's the thing. You're not just competing with Wall Street. You're competing with a new class of small investors. You're competing with the Airbnb-ification of neighborhoods, where homes are stripped from the long-term market to become short-term hotels. You're competing with mom-and-pop investors who own 5, 10, or 20 properties, using the equity from their first home to outbid you on your first home. House hacking on steroids. About 1/3 of American homes are now purchased entirely with cash. Let that sink in. And this changes the nature of the negotiation completely. If you're a seller and you have two offers, one with a young family with a mortgage contingency and a 5% down payment, and one with an LLC with all cash and a 10-day close, who do you pick? You pick the cash. Every time. Right. This isn't a competition of merit or hard work. It's a competition of liquidity. And money doesn't need sleep. Money doesn't need a place to live. While the price of buying a home has soared, the cost of not owning a home has become its own prison. This is what I call the rent trap. In the past, rent was significantly cheaper than a mortgage, which allowed people to save for a down payment. Today, in many markets, rent is equal to or higher than the cost of a mortgage. This creates a vicious cycle. You can't save for a house because your rent is taking 40 or 50% of your paycheck, and you can't lower your monthly costs because you can't afford the down payment to buy. Add to this the deck anchor. The generation trying to enter the market today is the most indebted in history. Student loans aren't just a monthly bill, they're a direct hit to your debt-to-income ratio, which is the primary metric banks use to decide if you are worthy of a mortgage. By the time the average graduate pays down enough debt to qualify and saves enough for a down payment, the market has moved again. The goalposts aren't just shifting, they're attached to a rocket ship. You're always paying the price for arriving late in a game you never chose to play. This is the most dangerous part. People don't just get locked out, they disengage. They stop saving, they stop planning, they stop believing effort leads to stability. That's not laziness, that's learned helplessness. When a generation stops believing in the future, societies rot from the inside. We're seeing it in the data. People are delaying marriage, they're delaying children, they're delaying the roots that make a community stable. Look, if you don't own the ground you stand on, and you feel like you never will, why would you invest in the local school board? Why would you care about the long term health of the neighborhood? When a society becomes a nation of renters, the social contract begins to fray. We're moving toward a system where economic security depends less on what you earn and more on what your family already owns. If your parents own a home, you have a safety net and an eventual inheritance. If they don't, you're starting the race 10 miles behind. But there's a dimension we rarely talk about when we say first time buyer. Not everyone is starting from the same place. Racial homeownership gaps between white, black, and Hispanic households are as white today as they were decades ago, and they show up most sharply at the entry level. Black and Hispanic buyers are more likely to be first-timers, more likely to carry student debt, more likely to spend a bigger share of income on rent, and more likely to be denied a mortgage even when they do apply. When you add that to a market where down payment help and inheritances are heavily skewed towards families that already own property, the latter isn't just missing rungs, it's missing rungs for specific groups first. People respond to this crisis by telling you, just move, go to the Midwest, go to a cheaper city. But this is a geographic mirage. First, the cheap cities are only cheap until people actually move there. We saw this in Boise, Austin, and Phoenix, the so-called Zoom towns. During the pandemic, remote workers brought big city equity into these markets, and prices in some of them more than doubled compared with 2019 levels. Even after recent corrections, a house in Boise or Austin is still dramatically more expensive than it was 5 years ago, which means the locals who grew up there are now competing with imported wealth in their own hometowns. The influx of equity refugees from California and New York drives up prices for everyone else, spreading the crisis like a virus. Second, just moving assumes that jobs are everywhere. But for most young professionals, their income is tied to specific hubs. Telling a tech worker to move to a rural town where there's no high-speed internet or industry isn't a solution. Telling a nurse to move where the hospitals are underfunded isn't a solution. If moving solved this, the problem would have corrected itself years ago. The reality is that the housing crisis is now a national phenomenon. There are no more hiding places. The door didn't close by accident. It closed because we built a system that rewards ownership instead of entry. We prioritize the stability of people who were already inside over the accessibility of people trying to enter. The tension underneath all of this is simple. Housing is being asked to do two incompatible jobs at once, to function as both a basic necessity and a financial asset. And as long as that tension remains unresolved, the market will continue to reward people who are already inside it and exclude the people trying to enter. When the latter breaks, it doesn't just affect the people at the bottom, it changes the shape of the entire system above them. If you want to see the similar kind of video on the topic, "Is AI a bubble?" then click on the video flashing on your screen right now. See you there. Bye.